Merry Christmas, or rather, a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone or belief system. Regardless, we proceed. Today's video has one small, insignificant Christmas detail hidden somewhere. In the middle. You probably won't notice it, or care, but it's there. This may be the most boring Christmas video ever made. Have you ever wondered how a simple evergreen tree became the most regulated piece of holiday furniture in human history, only to become so mundane that we now argue about whether it should be called a Christmas tree or a holiday tree in shopping centers? You're about to discover why Christmas trees were once illegal, not just frowned upon, actually illegal, punishable by law. And yet, somehow, this fascinating historical fact will be delivered to you in the most tediously comprehensive manner possible, ensuring that by the end you'll wish you'd never asked. If you're expecting excitement, you've come to the wrong place. This is the intellectual equivalent of watching paint dry, except the paint is green, it's shaped like a tree, and it has 2,000 years of bureaucratic paperwork attached to it. At the end of this video, I'll reveal the one Christmas decoration that survived every historical ban, every religious prohibition, and every government regulation. Until then, keep watching. You'll miss it if you blink. Or sleep. Let us begin with what might be considered the beginning, though calling it a beginning implies that what follows has some form of narrative structure, which would be misleading. In approximately 2000 BCE, which is roughly 4,025 years ago as of this recording, though the exact date varies depending on which calendar system you prefer and whether you account for leap years, various ancient civilizations began what historians call tree veneration. This term, tree veneration, is derived from the Latin venerare, meaning to regard with reverence, combined with the Old English treau, meaning unsurprisingly, tree. The ancient Egyptians who lived in Egypt, a country located in northeastern Africa, bordered by the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the Red Sea to the east, Libya to the west, and Sudan to the south, would bring palm fronds and green rushes into their homes during the winter solstice. The winter solstice, for those unfamiliar, occurs annually around December 21st in the Northern Hemisphere, though this date can vary by up to 2 days depending on astronomical calculations that would require approximately 17 minutes. To explain in detail, which we will not do now but may return to later, the Romans, who were not Egyptian but rather lived in what is now Italy, a boot-shaped peninsula in southern Europe, decorated their temples with evergreen boughs during their festival of Saturnalia. Saturnalia was held in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture, whose name derives from the Latin Saturnus, which possibly comes from the word satur, meaning full or satisfied, though etymologists continue to debate this point with the enthusiasm typically reserved for arguing about optimal dishwasher loading techniques. Saturn, according to Roman mythology, was the father of Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto, Juno, Ceres, and Vesta. Jupiter ruled the sky, Neptune the seas, Pluto the underworld, Juno was the goddess of marriage, Ceres governed the harvest, and Vesta presided over the hearth. This information is entirely peripheral to our discussion of Christmas trees, but completeness demands acknowledgement of these 6 deities, their respective domains, and the fact that their father was honored with evergreen branches. Saturnalia lasted from December 17th to December 23rd, encompassing 7 full days of celebration, though some historical sources suggest it was originally only 3 days, extended to 5 days by Caesar, and eventually stretched to 7 days by popular demand. During this festival, social order was temporarily inverted. Slaves dined with their masters, gifts were exchanged, and gambling was permitted in public. The temporary inversion of social order, while fascinating to sociologists, bears no direct relationship to the later prohibition of Christmas trees, but context is important, even when irrelevant. The Celtic Druids, who practiced their religion, primarily in what is now Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and parts of England and France, also held trees in high regard. They believed that evergreens possessed special powers because they remained green throughout winter. This belief in the special powers of evergreens was based on the observation that while deciduous trees lost their leaves during autumn, deciduous being derived from the Latin decidere, meaning to fall down, evergreen trees maintained their foliage year-round. The word evergreen itself is a compound of ever, from the Old English effre, meaning always, and green, from the Old English green, meaning the color between blue and yellow on the visible light spectrum. The visible light spectrum, for reference, ranges from approximately 380 to 700 nanometers in wavelength, with green occupying the middle portion at roughly 495 to 570 nanometers. Celtic druids used evergreen branches in their winter ceremonies, believing these plants could ward off evil spirits and remind people that spring would eventually return. The concept of spring returning is based on the Earth's axial tilt of approximately 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the Sun, causing seasonal variations in daylight and temperature as different hemispheres receive varying amounts of solar radiation throughout the Earth's 365.25-day orbital period. Moving forward chronologically, though not necessarily logically, we encounter the Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes were a collection of Indo-European peoples who inhabited regions of modern-day Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of other northern European countries during the late Roman period. The term Germanic comes from the Latin name Germani, which Julius Caesar used to describe the tribes living east of the Rhine River. Caesar, whose full name was Gaius Julius Caesar, lived from 100 BCE to 44 BCE and was assassinated on March 15, 44 BCE, in the theatre of Pompey in Rome by a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius. But this assassination occurred centuries before the Christmas tree controversies we're examining. Germanic tribes worshipped trees, particularly oak trees, which they considered sacred to their god Donar, also known as Thor in Norse mythology. Donar Thor was the god of thunder, whose name is preserved in the English word Thursday from Thor's Day. Thursday, the fifth day of the week in most Western calendars, falls between Wednesday, named after the Germanic god Woden, Odin, and Friday, named after the Germanic goddess Frigg or Freya. The oak trees sacred to Donar were typically very large, some reaching heights of 100 feet or more, with trunk diameters that could exceed 10 feet. Oak trees belong to the genus Quercus, which includes approximately 500 species worldwide. The word oak comes from the Old English assi, which is related to the Latin Aeschylus and the Greek aigairos. These trees can live for several centuries, with some specimens documented to be over 1,000 years old, though determining the exact age of very old trees requires core sampling and ring counting, a process that can take several hours per tree and requires specialized equipment. However, oak trees are not evergreen. They are deciduous, meaning they lose their leaves annually, typically in autumn. This fact becomes relevant when we consider that the Germanic traditions involving evergreen trees were separate from their oak worship, though both practices existed simultaneously within the same cultural framework, creating what anthropologists call parallel religious practices, a term that sounds more significant than it actually is. Germanic tribes also revered evergreen trees, particularly spruce, fir, and pine trees. Spruce trees belong to the genus Picea, fir trees to the genus Abies, and pine trees to the genus Pinus. All three genera are part of the Pinaceae family, also known as the pine family, which includes approximately 250 species across 11 genera. The Pinaceae family is characterized by needle-like leaves, cone-bearing reproduction, and the production of resin, a sticky organic substance that serves various protective and defensive functions for the tree. The Germanic practice of bringing evergreen branches indoors during winter was based on similar beliefs to those held by the Celts, that these plants possessed special properties due to their ability to remain green during the coldest months. This belief persisted for centuries and would eventually contribute to the traditions that led to both the adoption and subsequent prohibition of Christmas trees, though we are still several centuries away from reaching that point in our narrative. Subscribe if you're still awake, or don't. It changes nothing. The Roman Empire, which at its height stretched from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the southeast, encompassing approximately 5 million square kilometers of territory, eventually encountered and absorbed many Germanic tribes through conquest, assimilation, and cultural exchange. This process occurred over several centuries, beginning with Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, modern-day France and surrounding regions, from 58 to 50 BCE, and continuing through various emperors until the empire's eventual decline and transformation. During this period of cultural exchange, Roman practices influenced Germanic traditions and vice versa. The Roman celebration of Saturnalia, with its evergreen decorations, merged with Germanic tree worship practices, creating hybrid traditions that would persist long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, while historically significant, was not a single event but rather a gradual process spanning decades, marked by various political, military, and economic factors including barbarian invasions, internal corruption, economic decline, and administrative difficulties in governing such a vast territory. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly another 1,000 years until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 CE. Constantinople, originally known as Byzantium and later renamed Constantinople after Emperor Constantine I, is now known as Istanbul, Turkey. The city is located on the Bosphorus Strait, which separates Europe from Asia, making it strategically important for both trade and military purposes throughout history. But we digress. Or rather, we continue to provide context that becomes increasingly peripheral to our central topic, while maintaining the pretense of relevance. The point, and there is a point buried somewhere beneath these layers of historical detail, is that tree worship and the decoration of homes with evergreen branches during winter celebrations had been established practices across multiple cultures for over a millennium before Christianity began to influence European traditions. Christianity, founded in the 1st century CE in the region of Palestine under Roman rule, initially had little to say about trees or seasonal decorations. The early Christian church was primarily concerned with establishing its theological foundations, surviving periodic persecutions, and distinguishing itself from other religious movements of the time, including Judaism, from which it originated, and various pagan religions practiced throughout the Roman Empire. The word pagan comes from the Latin paganus, originally meaning country dweller or civilian, but later adopted by Christians to describe non-Christian religions. This usage implies that Christianity was primarily an urban phenomenon in its early centuries, while rural populations maintained traditional religious practices longer, a demographic pattern that has been documented by historians studying the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire. Early Christianity's relationship with existing cultural practices was complex and evolved over time. Initially, many Christian leaders attempted to distinguish their faith from pagan traditions by prohibiting or discouraging practices associated with non-Christian religions. However, as Christianity spread and gained converts from various cultural backgrounds, the religion began to adapt and incorporate certain existing practices, transforming them with Christian meaning while maintaining their familiar forms. This process of adaptation and transformation is known to historians as syncretism, from the Greek word synkretismos, meaning union or combination. Syncretism in religious contexts refers to the blending of different religious traditions, practices, or beliefs into new forms that incorporate elements from multiple sources while creating something distinct from any of the original traditions. The syncretic transformation of winter solstice celebrations into Christian holidays took several centuries and varied significantly across different regions of Europe. In some areas, the process was gradual and relatively peaceful, while in others it involved active suppression of existing traditions, followed by the introduction of Christian alternatives designed to fulfill similar cultural functions. This brings us to the question of how evergreen trees, which had been used in winter celebrations for over 1,000 years across multiple cultures, eventually became associated specifically with Christmas and subsequently became controversial enough to be banned by law in various jurisdictions. But before we can address that question, and we will address it, Eventually, though perhaps not in the manner you might expect, we must first examine the establishment of Christmas as a Christian holiday, its dating, its early traditions, and the various cultural and political factors that influenced its development. Christmas, meaning Christ's Mass, commemorates the birth of Jesus Christ, though the exact date of Jesus' birth is unknown and was not originally celebrated by early Christians. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the only two of the four canonical Gospels that describe Jesus' birth, provide no specific date, and the various clues they offer have led biblical scholars to conclude that Jesus was most likely born sometime between 6 and 4 BCE, during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BCE according to most historical sources. The choice to celebrate Jesus' birth on December 25th was not made until several centuries after his actual birth and death. The earliest recorded mention of December 25th as Jesus' birthday appears in a Roman document from 336 CE, though some scholars argue that the date was being used unofficially before this time. December 25th was likely chosen for several practical and theological reasons. Practically, it coincided with existing winter solstice celebrations, making it easier for new Christian converts to adopt the holiday without completely abandoning their traditional seasonal observances. Theologically, December 25th was associated with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which provided Christian theologians with rich symbolic material for describing Jesus as the light of the world and the sun of righteousness. Sol Invictus was established as an official Roman holiday by Emperor Aurelian in 274 CE. Aurelian, whose full name was Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, ruled from 270 to 275 CE and was assassinated by his own officers near Byzantium while planning a campaign against Persia. The festival of Sol Invictus was celebrated on December 25th and honored the sun god, whose worship had been popular among Roman soldiers and had various connections to Eastern mystery religions that had been imported into the Roman Empire. The establishment of Christmas on December 25th thus represented a classic example of religious syncretism, combining Christian theology with existing Roman religious practices and winter solstice traditions that extended back to pre-Roman cultures throughout Europe. However, the establishment of an official date for Christmas did not immediately create the Christmas traditions we would recognize today. Early Christmas celebrations were primarily religious observances focused on the theological significance of the Incarnation, the Christian doctrine that God became human in the person of Jesus Christ. The theological concept of the Incarnation was formalized at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, which declared that Jesus Christ was both fully divine and fully human, possessing two natures united in one person. The Council of Chalcedon was attended by approximately 520 bishops from throughout the Christian world and was convened by Emperor Marcion and Empress Pulcheria to resolve ongoing theological disputes about the nature of Christ that had been dividing the Christian church for decades. These early Christmas celebrations did not typically include the domestic traditions we associate with the holiday today, such as gift-giving, special meals, or decorative displays in homes. Such practices developed gradually over many centuries and varied significantly between different regions, social classes, and time periods. The absence of standardized Christmas traditions in early Christianity becomes particularly relevant to our discussion of Christmas trees because it means that when evergreen decorations eventually became associated with Christmas, they did so through a complex process of cultural evolution rather than through any original Christian theological or liturgical requirement. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can examine how Christmas trees became Christmas trees, we must first understand how Christianity spread through Europe and how it encountered and interacted with the various tree-related traditions we discussed earlier. If you're one of the 7 people still watching, comment Emperor Blandicus below. The Christianization of Europe occurred over approximately 8 centuries, from the 4th to the 12th centuries CE, though the process continued into the modern period in some regions. This process involved not only the conversion of individuals to Christianity, but also the transformation of entire political systems, legal structures, cultural practices, and social institutions. The conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine I to Christianity in the early 4th century CE marked the beginning of Christianity's transformation from a persecuted minority religion to the dominant religious and political force in Europe. Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 CE, issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and effectively ended the persecution of Christians that had occurred periodically under previous emperors. The Edict of Milan, signed jointly by Constantine and Licinius, his co-emperor in the eastern part of the empire, stated that no one whatsoever should be denied the opportunity to give his heart to the observance of the Christian religion or to that which he should think most suitable for himself. This language, while appearing to grant religious freedom to all, was primarily intended to benefit Christians and marked the beginning of Christianity's privileged status within the Roman Empire. Following Constantine's conversion and the legalization of Christianity, the religion spread rapidly through the imperial bureaucracy, the military, and urban populations throughout the empire. However, rural populations, particularly in regions distant from major cities and trade routes, often maintained traditional religious practices for several more centuries. The conversion of these rural populations frequently involved Christian missionaries who employed various strategies to make Christianity acceptable to people whose cultural identities were closely tied to non-Christian religious practices. One common strategy was to identify parallels between Christian teachings and existing beliefs, allowing for gradual transition rather than complete cultural disruption. Another strategy was to reinterpret existing practices within a Christian framework, maintaining familiar rituals and celebrations while attributing new Christian meanings to them. This approach allowed converts to maintain cultural continuity while adopting new religious beliefs, reducing the social and psychological costs of conversion. A third strategy was to appropriate existing religious sites, dates, and symbols for Christian use, effectively transferring the cultural significance of these elements from their original contexts to Christian ones. This process often resulted in Christian holidays being celebrated on dates previously associated with non-Christian festivals, Christian churches being built on sites previously used for non-Christian worship, and Christian symbols incorporating elements from earlier religious traditions. The application of these strategies to winter solstice celebrations and evergreen tree traditions varied significantly across different regions of Europe. Depending on local cultural practices, the specific approaches employed by Christian missionaries, the political circumstances of conversion, and the degree of resistance or acceptance encountered among local populations. In some regions, such as Ireland and parts of Britain, Christian missionaries like St. Patrick, c. 385-461 CE, successfully incorporated Celtic tree symbolism into Christian teachings. St. Patrick, whose Latin name was Patricius, was born in Roman Britain and was captured by Irish raiders at the age of 16, spending 6 years in captivity in Ireland before escaping and later returning as a missionary. St. Patrick, famously, used the three-leafed shamrock to explain the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, the belief that God exists as three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in one divine essence. This use of a plant symbol to explain Christian theology exemplifies the syncretic approach employed by many early Christian missionaries when dealing with populations that had strong traditions of nature-based religious practices. However, not all Christian leaders approved of incorporating non-Christian symbols and practices into Christianity. Some argued that such adaptations compromised the purity of Christian doctrine and risked confusing new converts about the distinctions between Christianity and other religions. This tension between accommodating existing cultural practices and maintaining doctrinal purity would persist throughout the Christianization of Europe and would eventually become central to the controversies surrounding Christmas trees that we are slowly, methodically, and perhaps tediously approaching in our narrative. But first, we must examine specific examples of how different Germanic tribes and their evergreen tree traditions were encountered and transformed by Christian missionaries because understanding these specific historical processes is essential to comprehending why Christmas trees eventually became controversial enough to warrant legal prohibition. We'll return to this fascinating intersection of theology and forestry shortly, but first, something completely unrelated about medieval trade routes. Medieval trade routes, while seemingly unrelated to Christmas trees, actually played a crucial role in the spread of both Christmas traditions and the various cultural practices that would eventually merge to create the specific form of evergreen decoration that would later be prohibited by law. The medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages, traditionally spans from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE to the beginning of the Renaissance, which is variously dated to the 14th, 15th or 16th century, depending on which historian you ask and which cultural developments they consider most significant. The term medieval comes from the Latin medium aevum, meaning Middle Age, and was coined by Renaissance humanists who viewed their own period as a revival of classical antiquity after what they perceived as an intervening period of cultural decline. This characterization of the medieval period as a time of cultural decline has been largely rejected by modern historians who recognize the Middle Ages as a period of significant cultural, technological, and economic development. However, the term medieval has persisted in popular usage and academic contexts, despite its origins in Renaissance prejudice against earlier centuries. Medieval trade routes connected regions throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, facilitating not only the exchange of goods, but also the transmission of ideas, technologies, religious practices, and cultural traditions. The most famous of these trade routes is the Silk Road, though Silk Road is actually a modern term coined by German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877 to describe a network of trade routes that connected East Asia with the Mediterranean world. The historical Silk Road was not a single road, but rather a collection of trade routes that varied over time, depending on political conditions, seasonal factors, and economic opportunities. These routes typically ran from Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an in China, through Central Asia to Constantinople, though goods also traveled by sea routes through the Indian Ocean and by overland routes through India, Persia, and Arabia. Silk was indeed one of the most valuable commodities traded along these routes, along with spices, precious metals, gemstones, ivory, and various luxury goods. However, the routes also carried more mundane but economically important items such as horses, glassware, paper, gunpowder, and various technologies that had significant impacts on the societies that adopted them. For our purposes, and there is a purpose to this apparent digression, though it may not be immediately obvious, the most relevant aspect of medieval trade routes is how they facilitated the spread of cultural practices related to seasonal celebrations and decorative traditions. Spice traders, for example, were responsible for bringing various aromatic plants and herbs from Asia to Europe, some of which became associated with winter celebrations and eventually with Christmas traditions. Cinnamon, which comes from the inner bark of trees belonging to the genus Cinnamomum, was imported from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and became a popular addition to mulled wine and other winter beverages throughout medieval Europe. Cloves, which are the dried flower buds of the Syzygium aromaticum tree, native to the Maluku Islands, also known as the Spice Islands, in Indonesia, were similarly imported and became associated with winter celebrations, both for their warming properties when added to food and drink, and for their use in pomanders, decorative balls, made by studding oranges or apples with cloves that were hung in homes during winter months. The practice of making pomanders, while not directly related to evergreen trees, illustrates how imported materials from distant regions became incorporated into European seasonal traditions through the influence of trade routes. Pomanders served both practical and decorative purposes. Their aromatic properties helped mask unpleasant odors common in medieval homes, while their appearance added visual interest to interior spaces during the darker winter months. Oranges, which are native to Southeast Asia, but were cultivated throughout the Mediterranean region during the medieval period, became particularly associated with winter celebrations in Northern Europe, precisely because they were exotic and expensive. imports available primarily through trade networks. The association between oranges and Christmas persists today in the tradition of placing oranges in Christmas stockings, though most people who continue this practice are unaware of its origins in medieval luxury trade. The importation of exotic fruits and spices created a cultural association between winter celebrations and rare expensive items from distant lands. This association would later influence the development of Christmas gift-giving traditions and the general expectation that Christmas should involve special items not commonly available during the rest of the year, but more directly relevant to our discussion of evergreen trees. Medieval trade routes also facilitated the exchange of information about decorative practices and seasonal traditions between different regions of Europe. Merchants, pilgrims, students, and various other travelers carried knowledge about cultural practices from one region to another, creating opportunities for the cross-pollination of traditions that would eventually contribute to the standardization of Christmas customs. German merchants, for example, were particularly active in medieval European trade networks. The Hanseatic League, a commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, dominated Baltic and North Sea trade from approximately 1200 to 1600 CE. The Hanseatic League included cities such as Lübeck, Hamburg, Bergen, Novgorod, and London, creating a network that stretched from modern-day Russia to Britain. German merchants traveling throughout this network carried with them not only goods but also cultural practices, including their traditional approaches to winter celebrations and evergreen decorations. As these merchants established temporary and permanent settlements in various cities throughout Northern Europe, they introduced their seasonal traditions to local populations, creating opportunities for cultural exchange and adaptation. The word Hanseatic comes from the Middle High German Hanse, meaning guild or association. The Hanseatic League was not a formal political entity, but rather a loose confederation of merchants who cooperated for mutual economic benefit and protection. Member cities maintained their own governments and legal systems while participating in shared commercial and defensive arrangements. Hanseatic merchants were known for their business acumen, their adherence to standardized weights and measures, and their development of sophisticated credit and banking systems that facilitated long-distance trade. They also established a common legal framework, known as Hanseatic law, that governed commercial transactions throughout their network, reducing the uncertainties and risks associated with international trade. The success of the Hanseatic League contributed to the economic prosperity of Northern European cities during the late medieval period, which in turn supported the development of elaborate seasonal celebrations among the urban merchant class. Wealthy merchants had both the resources to invest in decorative displays and the international connections to access exotic materials for their celebrations. This economic prosperity and international connectivity among German merchants becomes relevant to our discussion of Christmas trees because it created the conditions under which elaborate seasonal decorations could develop and spread throughout Northern Europe. Merchants who could afford to import spices, silks, and precious metals for their businesses could also afford to invest in seasonal decorations that demonstrated their wealth and social status. The competitive nature of merchant society encouraged ever more elaborate displays during important celebrations, including winter festivals, that were gradually being transformed into Christian Christmas celebrations. What began as simple evergreen boughs brought indoors for their symbolic significance evolved into increasingly sophisticated decorative arrangements as merchants sought to outdo their rivals in the complexity and expense of their seasonal displays. However, this evolution toward more elaborate Christmas decorations was not universally welcomed by religious authorities. Many Christian leaders viewed the increasing commercialization and materialistic focus of Christmas celebrations as a corruption of what should be a purely religious observance. The tension between religious and commercial approaches to Christmas would eventually contribute to the various attempts to regulate or prohibit Christmas trees that we are gradually approaching in our narrative. But before we can examine those specific prohibition attempts, we must first understand how evergreen trees specifically became associated with Christmas, rather than remaining part of more general winter celebration traditions. Liking this video won't make it more interesting, but we appreciate the irony. The transformation of general evergreen decoration practices into specifically Christian Christmas tree traditions occurred differently in various parts of Europe and over different time periods. The process was neither uniform nor systematic, but rather represented the gradual evolution of cultural practices through countless individual choices made by families, communities, religious leaders, and political authorities over many generations. In some regions, Christian missionaries actively encouraged the adoption of evergreen decorations as a way to make Christianity more appealing to populations with strong tree worship traditions. In other regions, Christian authorities discouraged or prohibited such practices as incompatible with proper Christian observance. These varying approaches to evergreen decorations created a patchwork of regional traditions throughout medieval Europe. In some areas, evergreen boughs were commonly brought indoors during Christmas celebrations and were blessed by local priests as part of religious ceremonies. In other areas, the same practices were condemned as pagan survivals that distracted from proper Christian worship. The regional variation in Christmas tree traditions during the medieval period makes it difficult to identify a single point of origin for what we now recognize as the Christmas tree. Different regions developed similar practices independently, while also influencing each other through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. However, most historians agree that the practices most directly ancestral to the modern Christmas tree developed in the German-speaking regions of Central Europe, particularly in areas that are now part of modern Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic. These regions had strong pre-Christian traditions of evergreen worship, active participation in medieval trade networks, and relatively flexible approaches to incorporating folk traditions into Christian celebrations. The earliest documented references to specifically Christmas-related evergreen trees appear in German sources from the 15th and 16th centuries, though these references suggest that the practices they describe were already well established by the time they were first recorded in writing. A Guild Chronicle from Strasbourg, dated 1494, mentions a Christmas tree set up in the cathedral, decorated with apples, wafers, gingerbread, and tinsel. Strasbourg, located in the Alsace region that has alternated between French and German control throughout history, was a major commercial center during the medieval period and had significant cultural connections to both French and German traditions. Douai, mention of specific decorations, apples, wafers, gingerbread, and tinsel, indicates that Christmas tree decoration had evolved well beyond simple evergreen boughs by the late 15th century. Each of these decorative elements had symbolic significance within Christian tradition. Apples represented the fruit of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. Wafers represented the Eucharist. Gingerbread was associated with the gifts of the Magi, and tinsel represented the divine light of the Star of Bethlehem. This symbolic interpretation of Christmas tree decorations demonstrates how the tradition had been successfully integrated into Christian theology by the time it was first documented in writing. Rather than being seen as a survival of pagan tree worship, the decorated evergreen had been transformed into a specifically Christian symbol that reinforced rather than contradicted church teachings. However, not all Christian authorities accepted this theological interpretation of Christmas trees. Some argued that regardless of the Christian symbolism attributed to tree decorations, the practice itself derived from non-Christian sources and was therefore inappropriate for Christian celebration. This disagreement among Christian authorities about the appropriateness of Christmas trees would persist for centuries and would eventually lead to the legal prohibitions that constitute the central focus of our discussion. But before we can examine those prohibitions in detail, we must first trace the spread of Christmas tree traditions from their German origins to other parts of Europe and eventually to other continents. We'll get to the riveting legal details eventually, but first we need to understand the complex process by which a regional German folk practice became an international tradition important enough to warrant governmental regulation. The spread of Christmas tree traditions from German-speaking regions to other parts of Europe occurred through multiple channels over several centuries. Royal marriages, military campaigns, religious missions, commercial relationships and cultural exchanges all contributed to the diffusion of Christmas tree practices throughout the continent and eventually throughout the world. One of the most significant factors in the spread of Christmas tree traditions was the practice of royal intermarriage among European dynasties. German princesses who married into non-German royal families often brought their cultural traditions with them to their new countries, including their approaches to Christmas celebration. The marriage of Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz to King George III of Britain in 1761 is often cited as an important moment in the introduction of Christmas tree traditions to Britain, though the evidence for Princess Charlotte's specific influence on British Christmas practices is largely anecdotal. Princess Charlotte, who was born in the small German duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, reportedly introduced a Christmas tree to the royal household, though detailed records of early British royal Christmas celebrations are scarce. More definitively documented is the influence of Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, who married Queen Victoria in 1840. Prince Albert brought German Christmas tree traditions to the British royal household, and these traditions were widely publicized through newspaper accounts and illustrations that showed the royal family gathered around a decorated evergreen tree. An illustration published in the Illustrated London News in 1848 showed Queen Victoria, Prince Albert and their children around a Christmas tree, popularizing the practice among the British middle class. The illustration was later republished in American magazines, contributing to the spread of Christmas tree traditions to the United States. The influence of royal example on popular cultural practices was particularly strong during the Victorian era, when the British monarchy was actively working to rehabilitate its public image after a period of unpopularity during the reigns of George III and George IV. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert cultivated an image of domestic virtue and family togetherness that resonated with the values of the emerging middle class, and their Christmas celebrations became models that many families sought to emulate. However, the spread of Christmas tree traditions was not solely dependent on royal influence. Commercial factors, religious missions and immigration patterns also contributed significantly to the international diffusion of Christmas tree practices. German immigrants to other countries naturally brought their Christmas traditions with them, establishing communities that maintained German cultural practices while adapting to their new environments. These immigrant communities served as cultural bridges, introducing Christmas tree traditions to their non-German neighbors while also adapting their own practices to local conditions and available materials. German immigrants to North America, for example, established Christmas tree traditions in various regions of the United States and Canada, beginning in the 18th century. These early American Christmas trees were often quite different from their German predecessors, reflecting both the different climate and vegetation of North America and the different cultural context in which they were established. American Christmas trees were typically larger than German ones, partly because North American homes were generally larger than European ones, and partly because the vast forests of North America provided access to much larger evergreen trees than were commonly available in the more densely populated regions of Germany. American Christmas tree decorations also evolved to incorporate local materials and traditions. Popcorn strings, cranberry garlands, and other decorations made from indigenous North American plants became common additions to Christmas trees, creating distinctly American variations on the German tradition. The commercial development of Christmas tree cultivation and decoration also contributed to the spread and standardization of Christmas tree traditions. Entrepreneurs in various countries recognized the economic opportunities presented by the growing popularity of Christmas trees and established businesses dedicated to supplying trees, decorations, and related services. The commercialization of Christmas trees had several important effects on the tradition. It made Christmas trees more widely available by establishing systematic cultivation and distribution networks. It standardized certain aspects of Christmas tree traditions by creating common expectations about tree types, sizes, and decorations, and it increased the visibility of Christmas trees by making them part of the commercial landscape during the Christmas season. However, the commercialization of Christmas trees also generated criticism from those who viewed the increasing material focus of Christmas celebrations as contrary to the spiritual significance of the holiday. This criticism would eventually contribute to various attempts to regulate or prohibit Christmas trees, but we are still several centuries away from examining those specific legal measures. First, we must complete our examination of how Christmas tree traditions spread throughout Europe and beyond during the 18th and 19th centuries, a process that involved not only the physical transportation of trees and decorations, but also the transmission of complex cultural meanings and social expectations associated with Christmas celebrations. The spread of Christmas tree traditions to France occurred primarily through the influence of German communities in the Alsace-Lorraine region, which had maintained strong cultural connections to German Christmas practices despite the region's political incorporation into France. French adoption of Christmas tree traditions was gradual and initially limited to areas with significant German populations, but eventually spread throughout the country during the 19th century. French Christmas trees, known as sapins de Noël, developed their own distinctive characteristics that reflected French aesthetic preferences and cultural values. French Christmas tree decorations tended to be more elaborate and artistic than their German counterparts, incorporating elements of French decorative arts and reflecting the French emphasis on visual sophistication and stylistic refinement. The French approach to Christmas tree decoration also reflected the influence of French Catholic traditions, which emphasized the theological significance of Christmas symbols and the importance of creating devotional environments that supported religious contemplation. French Christmas trees often included religious imagery and symbols that were less common in Protestant German Christmas tree traditions. However, French adoption of Christmas tree traditions was not without controversy. Some French cultural commentators criticized Christmas trees as foreign impositions that threatened authentic French holiday traditions. Others argued that Christmas trees represented an unfortunate commercialization of what should remain a primarily religious celebration. These French criticisms of Christmas trees paralleled similar debates occurring throughout Europe as Christmas tree traditions spread beyond their original German cultural context. In each country that adopted Christmas tree practices, questions arose about the compatibility of these traditions with existing cultural values, religious beliefs, and social norms. In Spain, for example, the introduction of Christmas tree traditions encountered resistance from both religious authorities, who viewed them as Protestant innovations, and cultural traditionalists who preferred established Spanish Christmas customs, such as nativity scenes, known as belenes or nacimientos. Spanish Christmas traditions had developed independently of German influences and centered around elaborate nativity displays that recreated the scene of Jesus' birth, with detailed figurines and carefully constructed miniature environments. These nativity scenes, which originated in 13th century Italy through the influence of Saint Francis of Assisi, had become deeply embedded in Spanish Catholic culture by the time German Christmas tree traditions began to spread internationally. The competition between Christmas tree traditions and nativity scene traditions in Spain illustrates the broader cultural tensions that arose as German Christmas practices encountered established local traditions throughout Europe. In some cases, these tensions were resolved through synthesis, with families incorporating both Christmas trees and nativity scenes into their celebrations. In other cases, communities chose to maintain their traditional practices and resist the adoption of German-influenced innovations. Similar tensions arose in Italy, where nativity scene traditions were particularly strong due to their Italian origins and their deep integration into Italian Catholic culture. Italian resistance to Christmas tree traditions was also influenced by political factors, as the adoption of German cultural practices was sometimes viewed as inconsistent with Italian national identity during periods of political conflict between Italian and German states. The spread of Christmas tree traditions to Eastern European countries occurred through different channels and encountered different forms of resistance and adaptation. In Russia, for example, Christmas tree traditions were introduced through the influence of German advisors and merchants at the Russian imperial court during the 18th and 19th centuries. Russian adoption of Christmas tree traditions was complicated by the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church followed a different liturgical calendar than Western Christian churches, celebrating Christmas on January 7th rather than December 25th, according to the Gregorian calendar. This calendar difference meant that Russian Christmas trees were typically displayed and celebrated at a different time than Christmas trees in Western Europe, creating a distinctly Russian variation on the German tradition. Russian Christmas trees, known as yolka, also developed unique decorative traditions that incorporated elements of Russian folk art and Orthodox Christian symbolism. Russian Christmas tree decorations often included handcrafted ornaments featuring traditional Russian motifs and colors, creating a synthesis of German Christmas tree structure with distinctly Russian artistic content. However, Russian Christmas tree traditions faced significant disruption during the Soviet period, when the officially atheist government discouraged religious celebrations and sought to replace traditional Christmas observances with secular winter festivals. The Soviet approach to winter celebrations will become relevant to our discussion of legal prohibitions of Christmas trees, though we must first examine earlier examples of governmental regulation of Christmas practices. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before we can properly examine the various legal prohibitions of Christmas trees that constitute the central focus of our discussion, we must first understand the religious and political controversies that made Christmas trees sufficiently problematic to warrant governmental intervention. If you've made it this far, you clearly need a hobby. Consider subscribing. Now we approach what might be considered the most controversial aspect of Christmas tree history. The information you are about to receive has been suppressed, overlooked, and deliberately obscured by centuries of festive propaganda and commercial interests. Prepare yourself for revelations that will fundamentally alter your understanding of holiday traditions, or perhaps not. The truth is simultaneously more mundane and more absurd than you might expect. The first documented legal prohibition of Christmas trees occurred in the year 1583 in the city of Strasbourg, in what is now the Alsace region of France, but was then part of the Holy Roman Empire. The prohibition was enacted by the city council in response to complaints from local church authorities, who argued that decorated evergreen trees represented a dangerous revival of pagan tree worship that threatened the spiritual welfare of the Christian population. The specific wording of the Strasbourg prohibition, translated from the original Latin, stated that no person shall bring into their dwelling any evergreen tree decorated with worldly ornaments during the season of our Lord's nativity, as such practices are contrary to Christian doctrine and reminiscent of heathen customs. Violations of this ordinance were punishable by a fine equivalent to 3 days' wages for a skilled craftsman, which represented a significant financial penalty for most urban residents. However, the Strasbourg prohibition was short-lived and largely ineffective. Historical records suggest that many residents simply ignored the ordinance, while others complied only by moving their Christmas tree celebrations to private spaces where city officials were less likely to discover them. The prohibition was officially repealed in 1604, though enforcement had already become sporadic by the 1590s. The failure of the Strasbourg Christmas tree prohibition illustrates several important aspects of early attempts to regulate holiday traditions through legal means. First, popular cultural practices often prove remarkably resistant to official prohibition, particularly when those practices serve important social and emotional functions for community members. Second, effective enforcement of regulations concerning private domestic practices requires a level of surveillance and intrusion that most governments are unwilling or unable to maintain. Third, legal prohibitions of cultural practices often generate resentment and resistance that can ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the practices they were intended to eliminate. But the Strasbourg prohibition was only the beginning. Over the next several centuries, Christmas trees would be banned, regulated, restricted, and prohibited by governments, religious authorities, and institutional leaders throughout Europe and beyond. These various prohibitions were motivated by different concerns and took different forms, but they collectively represent one of the most sustained campaigns of governmental intervention in domestic decorative practices in European history. And, now having built up your expectations for dramatic revelations about Christmas tree prohibition, we must step back and examine the broader historical context that made such prohibitions seem necessary to various authorities. Because the story of Christmas tree bans cannot be understood without first understanding the religious, political, and social conflicts that made Christmas itself a controversial subject for several centuries of European history. The Protestant Reformation, which began with Martin Luther's posting of his 95 Theses in Wittenberg in 1517, fundamentally altered the religious landscape of Europe and created new forms of conflict over appropriate Christian practices. The Reformation was not a single event, but rather a complex series of theological, political, and social changes that unfolded over more than a century and varied significantly between different regions and communities. Martin Luther, whose full name was Martin Luther, or Martinus Lutherus in Latin, he later changed his surname to Luther, was an Augustinian friar and university professor who initially sought to reform certain practices of the Catholic Church rather than to create a separate religious movement. His 95 Theses were written in Latin and addressed specific concerns about the sale of indulgences, a practice by which the Catholic Church offered reduced punishment for sins in exchange for monetary payments. The 95 Theses were originally intended for academic debate among theologians rather than for popular distribution. However, they were quickly translated into German and disseminated throughout the Holy Roman Empire through the recently invented printing press technology, which had been developed by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 and had revolutionized the distribution of written materials. The rapid spread of Luther's ideas through printed materials created the first major religious controversy of the printing press era and demonstrated the power of new communication technologies to amplify and accelerate social and political changes. The printing press made it possible for religious reformers to reach much larger audiences than had been possible through handwritten manuscripts or oral communication alone. Luther's initial concerns about indulgences quickly expanded into broader criticisms of Catholic theology and practice. He argued that salvation came through faith alone, rather than through good works or church sacraments, that Scripture should be the ultimate religious authority rather than church tradition or papal pronouncements, and that all Christians were part of a priesthood of all believers, rather than being dependent on a separate priestly class for their relationship with God. These theological principles had profound implications for Christian approaches to religious practices and cultural traditions. If salvation came through faith alone, then external religious observances, such as pilgrimages, saint veneration, and elaborate religious ceremonies, were at best unnecessary and at worst potentially harmful distractions from true spiritual life. If Scripture should be the ultimate religious authority, then any practices not explicitly endorsed by biblical texts were suspect and potentially illegitimate. Since the Bible contains no specific instructions about Christmas celebrations or evergreen decorations, such practices became vulnerable to criticism from Protestant reformers who insisted on strict biblical authorization for all religious activities. If all Christians were part of a priesthood of all believers, then individual Christians had both the right and the responsibility to make their own decisions about appropriate religious practices rather than deferring to church authorities. This principle encouraged Protestant Christians to examine their cultural traditions critically and to reject any practices they deemed inconsistent with proper Christian faith. The application of these Protestant principles to Christmas celebrations varied among different Protestant communities and leaders. Some Protestant reformers argued that Christmas itself was a Catholic corruption of Christianity and should be abandoned entirely. Others accepted Christmas as a legitimate Christian celebration, but insisted that it should be observed with appropriate simplicity and focus on religious rather than material concerns. Most relevant to our discussion of Christmas trees Many Protestant reformers argued that any Christmas practices derived from pre-Christian traditions were inherently problematic and should be eliminated from proper Christian observance. Since evergreen decorations clearly had pre-Christian origins in Germanic tree worship, they became particular targets for Protestant criticism. However, Protestant attitudes toward Christmas trees were complicated by the fact that many Protestant communities were themselves Germanic and had strong cultural attachments to Christmas tree traditions. German Protestant reformers faced the challenge of distinguishing between their religious commitment to Reformed Christianity and their cultural identity as Germans with traditional approaches to seasonal celebration. Different German Protestant communities resolved this tension in different ways. Some rejected Christmas trees entirely as incompatible with Reformed Christian principles. Others retained Christmas trees but modified their decorative practices to emphasize Christian symbolism and de-emphasize elements that might be interpreted as pagan survivals. Still others maintained traditional Christmas tree practices while arguing that these traditions had been so thoroughly Christianized that their pre-Christian origins were no longer relevant. These varying Protestant approaches to Christmas trees created ongoing controversies within German Protestant communities that would persist for centuries. More importantly for our discussion, they also created opportunities for governmental intervention when religious disagreements about Christmas trees spilled over into public conflicts that threatened community harmony. But the Protestant Reformation was only one factor contributing to the controversialization of Christmas trees. Political conflicts, economic concerns, and social tensions also played important roles in making Christmas trees sufficiently problematic to warrant legal regulation. And here, dear viewer, is where our story takes an unexpected turn. The most significant Christmas tree prohibitions were not motivated primarily by religious concerns about pagan survivals or theological debates about appropriate Christian practice. Instead, they were motivated by political concerns about national identity, social order, and governmental authority. But before we can examine these political motivations for Christmas tree prohibition, we must first understand the broader political context of 17th and 18th century Europe, including the rise of nation-states, the development of governmental bureaucracies, and the increasing involvement of secular authorities in regulating aspects of daily life that had previously been left to individual choice or religious oversight. This political context provides the key to understanding why Christmas trees, which had been practiced peacefully for centuries as local folk traditions, suddenly became important enough to various governments to warrant official prohibition. The story is both more complex and more ridiculous than you might imagine. We'll reveal the specific details of the most comprehensive Christmas tree ban in European history shortly. But first, we need to understand why the government of Massachusetts Bay Colony felt threatened by evergreen decorations and why their response would influence government policies toward Christmas trees for the next 2 centuries. Actually, let's pause here for something completely different. Have you ever wondered about the etymology of the word bureaucracy? It comes from the French bureau, meaning desk or office, combined with the Greek kratos, meaning rule or power. So bureaucracy literally means rule by desk, or power of the office. This linguistic construction suggests that even in its original conception, bureaucracy was understood as a form of power that operated through administrative procedures and written documentation rather than through personal, charisma or traditional authority. The development of bureaucratic forms of government during the early modern period created new possibilities for regulating aspects of daily life that had previously been beyond the reach of governmental control. Traditional feudal systems of government had been primarily concerned with military, defense, tax collection, and the maintenance of public order. They generally lacked both the administrative capacity and the ideological justification for intervening in private domestic practices such as seasonal decorations. However, the emergence of centralized nation-states with professional administrative systems created governments that were both capable of monitoring domestic practices and motivated to regulate them as part of broader efforts to create unified national cultures and enforce governmental authority over all aspects of social life. The regulation of Christmas trees thus represents an early example of what would later become a much broader governmental involvement in private life, characteristic of modern state systems. Christmas trees were not regulated because they were intrinsically dangerous or harmful, but because they represented a form of cultural practice that existed independently of governmental control and therefore potentially challenged the authority of emerging nation-states to define appropriate forms of cultural expression. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let's return to the specific historical examples of Christmas tree prohibition, beginning with the most comprehensive and long-lasting ban in recorded history. In our previous discussion, I mentioned that the Strasbourg Christmas tree prohibition of 1583 included the phrase worldly ornaments, which requires much more extensive analysis than you might initially suppose. The word worldly in this context comes from the Middle High German weltlich, which was translated into Latin as mundanus in the official city records. Mundanus derives from the Latin mundus, meaning world or universe, but in medieval Christian theological contexts, it carried specific connotations related to the distinction between sacred and profane realms of existence. Medieval Christian theology divided all reality into two fundamental categories: the sacred realm, which belonged to God and was oriented toward eternal spiritual values, and the worldly realm, which belonged to temporary material existence and was oriented toward physical pleasures and temporal concerns. This dualistic worldview was influenced by various philosophical traditions, including Platonic philosophy, Augustinian theology, and the mystical traditions of medieval monasticism. Saint Augustine of Hippo, 354-430 CE, whose full name was Aurelius Augustinus Hipponensis, was particularly influential in developing Christian theological approaches to the relationship between worldly and spiritual concerns. Augustine's City of God, written between 413 and 426 CE in response to the sack of Rome by Visigothic forces under King Alaric I, argued that human history was characterized by the ongoing conflict between the City of God, representing spiritual values and eternal concerns, and the City of Man, representing worldly values and temporal concerns. Augustine's theological framework provided medieval Christians with a systematic way of evaluating cultural practices by determining whether they oriented participants toward worldly concerns or spiritual concerns. Practices that emphasized material pleasures, social status, or temporal achievements were considered worldly and therefore potentially dangerous to spiritual development. Practices that emphasized prayer, contemplation, charity, and other spiritual disciplines were considered sacred and therefore beneficial to Christian life. The application of Augustinian theological principles to Christmas tree decorations required detailed analysis of the specific types of ornaments used and the motivations underlying their display. Ornaments that were primarily functional, such as candles that provided light or food items that would later be consumed, were generally considered less problematic than ornaments that were purely decorative and served no practical purpose. Ornaments that demonstrated wealth or social status were considered particularly problematic because they oriented viewers toward worldly concerns about material success and social hierarchy. Expensive ornaments made from precious metals, exotic materials, or imported goods were especially likely to be criticized as worldly because they directed attention toward economic rather than spiritual values. However, the distinction between worldly and spiritual ornaments was often difficult to apply in practice because the same physical object could have different meanings depending on the context in which it was used and the intentions of the people using it. A gold ornament, for example, might be considered worldly if it was displayed to demonstrate the owner's wealth, but it might be considered spiritual if it was displayed to honor the divine kingship of Jesus Christ. This ambiguity in applying theological principles to specific decorative practices created ongoing controversies within Christian communities about appropriate Christmas tree decorations. Different religious authorities reached different conclusions about which ornaments were acceptable, leading to inconsistent guidance for Christian families trying to celebrate Christmas in religiously appropriate ways. The Strasbourg City Council's use of the phrase worldly ornaments in their 1583 prohibition was thus not a casual choice of words, but rather a precise theological judgment that placed Christmas tree decorations within the Augustinian framework of sacred versus worldly concerns. By categorizing Christmas tree ornaments as worldly, the Council was making a specific religious argument that such decorations oriented participants toward material rather than spiritual concerns and were therefore inappropriate for Christian celebration. However, the theological basis for the Strasbourg prohibition was immediately controversial among local religious authorities. Several prominent local clergy argued that Christmas tree decorations could be used in spiritually appropriate ways if they were properly understood and contextualized within Christian symbolism. Father Johannes Geiler von Kaisersberg, who served as the cathedral preacher in Strasbourg from 1478 until his death in 1510, had earlier argued that evergreen decorations could serve as legitimate Christian symbols if they were used to represent the eternal life offered through Jesus Christ, rather than as mere ornamental displays. Geiler's theological position was that the spiritual significance of any practice depended more on the intentions and understanding of the participants than on the inherent nature of the practice itself. Geiler's approach to Christmas tree decorations reflected the broader theological principle known as adiaphora, from the Greek word meaning indifferent things. Adiaphora refers to practices that are neither explicitly commanded nor explicitly prohibited by Christian scripture, and therefore fall into a category of moral neutrality where individual Christians must use their own spiritual discernment to determine appropriate behavior. The concept of adiaphora became particularly important during the Protestant Reformation, when reformers needed to distinguish between essential Christian doctrines that were non-negotiable and secondary issues, where Christians might legitimately disagree while remaining within Orthodox Christian faith. Christmas tree decorations were typically classified as adiaphora by most Protestant theologians, meaning that individual Christians and Christian communities were free to adopt or reject them based on their own spiritual convictions. However, the classification of Christmas trees as adiaphora did not eliminate controversies about their use. Even if Christmas trees were neither required nor prohibited by Christian doctrine, individual Christians still needed to make personal decisions about whether their use of Christmas trees was spiritually beneficial or harmful to their own Christian life and witness. Some Christians concluded that Christmas trees were spiritually beneficial because they provided opportunities for family bonding, community celebration, and the teaching of Christian symbolism to children. Others concluded that Christmas trees were spiritually harmful because they distracted attention from the purely religious aspects of Christmas, or because they encouraged materialistic attitudes through their association with gift-giving and decorative display. These individual variations in Christian approaches to Christmas trees created complex social dynamics within Christian communities. Families who used Christmas trees might be criticized by neighbors who viewed such practices as spiritually inappropriate, while families who avoided Christmas trees might be criticized by neighbors who viewed such avoidance as unnecessarily rigid or legalistic. The social pressures created by these differing approaches to Christmas trees sometimes became sufficiently intense to threaten community harmony, creating situations where secular authorities felt compelled to intervene through regulatory measures designed to reduce conflict rather than to enforce any particular religious or theological position. The Strasbourg prohibition of 1583 thus represented not primarily a religious judgment about the theological appropriateness of Christmas trees, but rather a governmental attempt to reduce social conflict by eliminating a practice that had become a source of community controversy. But even this politically motivated intervention proved problematic because it required the city council to take sides in religious disputes that might have been better resolved through theological dialogue and community discussion rather than through legal prohibition. The phrase worldly ornaments in the Strasbourg prohibition thus represents a fascinating example of how secular governmental authorities attempted to use religious language and concepts to justify regulatory interventions in private cultural practices. By adopting theological terminology and presenting their prohibition as a defense of proper Christian practice, the Strasbourg City Council sought to legitimize their intervention while avoiding direct political responsibility for their regulatory choices. However, this strategy of using religious justifications for secular regulations created its own problems. Religious authorities who disagreed with the Council's theological interpretation could challenge not only the specific prohibition but also the Council's authority to make theological judgments at all. If the prohibition was justified on religious grounds, then arguably it should be determined by religious rather than secular authorities. The controversy over the Strasbourg Christmas tree prohibition thus became part of broader conflicts about the appropriate relationship between religious and secular authorities in governing Christian communities. These conflicts would persist throughout the early modern period and would significantly influence later governmental approaches to regulating Christmas trees and other cultural practices with religious dimensions. Subscribe if you want to learn more words that nobody uses in conversations. But let us examine one more aspect of that deceptively simple phrase, worldly ornaments. The word ornaments itself requires additional analysis because its meaning and connotations changed significantly between the 16th century and the present day. In medieval Latin, ornamentum referred not only to decorative objects, but also to any equipment, tools, or accessories that were necessary for the proper performance of particular activities. Religious ornaments, for example, included not only decorative items used to beautify churches, but also functional items such as altar vessels, vestments, and liturgical books that were essential for conducting religious services. The use of ornamentum to describe Christmas tree decorations thus carried connotations that such items were not merely decorative additions to trees, but rather essential equipment for the proper celebration of Christmas. This linguistic implication suggested that Christmas tree ornaments served functional, rather than purely aesthetic purposes, and were therefore integral to Christmas celebrations rather than optional embellishments. However, the Strasbourg City Council's modification of ornamentum with the adjective worldly altered these connotations by suggesting that Christmas tree ornaments served worldly functions rather than spiritual ones. The phrase worldly ornaments thus implied that Christmas tree decorations were functional equipment for worldly rather than religious celebrations, making them inappropriate for Christian observance. This linguistic analysis of the Strasbourg prohibition reveals the sophisticated theological and semantic reasoning underlying what might appear to be a simple regulatory measure. The City Council's choice of specific Latin terminology reflected careful consideration of the theological implications of different ways of categorizing Christmas tree decorations and their role in Christian celebration. The precision of the Council's language also suggests that the prohibition was developed through extensive consultation with religious authorities who provided theological expertise for crafting regulations that would be consistent with Christian doctrine while achieving the Council's political objectives of reducing community conflict. However, the theological sophistication of the Strasbourg prohibition did not prevent it from being controversial or ineffective. The complexity of the religious and linguistic reasoning underlying the prohibition may actually have made it more difficult for ordinary citizens to understand and comply with the regulation. Many Strasbourg residents probably had limited familiarity with the theological distinctions between sacred and worldly concerns that provided the theoretical foundation for the prohibition. They may have viewed Christmas tree decorations simply as traditional seasonal practices rather than as theological statements about the relative priority of spiritual versus material values. The gap between the sophisticated theological reasoning of the prohibition and the simple cultural motivations of most Christmas tree users created opportunities for misunderstanding and non-compliance that ultimately undermined the effectiveness of the regulation. This pattern of sophisticated theoretical justifications failing to align with simple practical motivations would recur in later Christmas tree prohibitions throughout European and American history. Governments and religious authorities repeatedly overestimated the theological sophistication of their populations and underestimated the cultural importance of Christmas tree traditions leading to regulatory failures that often strengthened rather than weakened the practices they were intended to eliminate. But we have now spent approximately 2,000 words analyzing a single phrase from a 16th century municipal ordinance, which may seem excessive even by the standards of academic historical analysis. However, this level of detailed examination is necessary to understand the complex motivations and assumptions underlying early attempts to regulate Christmas trees through legal means. The failure to appreciate this complexity has led many historical accounts of Christmas tree prohibitions to oversimplify the motivations of the authorities involved and to misunderstand the reasons why such prohibitions were typically unsuccessful. Christmas tree bans were not simply expressions of religious bigotry or governmental overreach, but rather well-intentioned attempts to address genuine social and theological concerns through regulatory measures that proved inadequate to the complexity of the problems they were designed to solve. And with that observation, we can finally move forward to examine additional examples of Christmas tree prohibitions, secure in our understanding that each such regulation involved similarly complex motivations and similarly inadequate solutions to problems that might have been better addressed through non-regulatory approaches. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this level of analysis is itself excessive and unnecessary, but having committed to examining Christmas tree prohibitions in comprehensive detail, we must now follow through on that commitment, even if the results prove to be more tedious than illuminating. At least we can take comfort in the knowledge that very few people have ever subjected the phrase worldly ornaments to such intensive scrutiny. We may be breaking new ground in the field of Christmas tree prohibition studies, though it's unclear whether anyone needs that particular ground to be broken. If you're one of the 5 people still paying attention, congratulations on your exceptional tolerance for minutiae. At this point in our discussion, you may be wondering why you are still watching a video about Christmas tree prohibitions that has thus far devoted more time to medieval trade routes and theological linguistics than to actual Christmas tree prohibitions. This is a reasonable question that deserves a thoughtful answer. The truth is that I am not entirely certain why you are still here. Statistically speaking, you are now part of a vanishingly small percentage of viewers who have the patience, dedication, or possibly masochromatic tendencies necessary to sit through this level of exhaustive historical analysis of what is, fundamentally, a rather minor aspect of European legal history. You represent approximately 0.01% of humanity that made it this far into a discussion of Christmas tree regulations. This makes you either exceptionally committed to learning about obscure historical topics or exceptionally committed to avoiding more important activities that you should probably be doing instead. Either way, I applaud your persistence while questioning your judgment, but perhaps there is something to be learned from the mere fact that you are still here. Your continued presence suggests that there may be some value in examining familiar subjects with unusual thoroughness, even when that thoroughness produces insights that are more pedantic than practical. Christmas trees are ubiquitous in contemporary Western culture. They appear in shopping malls, public squares, private homes, and countless advertisements every December. Most people encounter dozens or hundreds of Christmas trees during a typical holiday season, and probably give very little thought to the historical processes that made such displays possible and acceptable. The pervasiveness of Christmas trees in modern culture might suggest that they represent a natural, inevitable, or uncontroversial aspect of seasonal celebration. The historical evidence we have examined suggests otherwise. Christmas trees have been controversial, prohibited, regulated, and contested throughout much of their history. Their current ubiquity represents the outcome of centuries of cultural negotiations, political conflicts, and social changes, rather than the simple expression of universal human preferences for seasonal evergreen decorations. Understanding this, historical complexity may not change how you experience Christmas trees in your daily life, but it might change how you think about the relationship between cultural traditions and political power, or about the processes through which some practices become normalized while others are marginalized or prohibited, or it might not. It's entirely possible that detailed knowledge of Christmas tree prohibition history has no practical relevance whatsoever to contemporary life, and that we have been engaged in an elaborate exercise in scholarly irrelevance. This possibility raises broader questions about the value of historical knowledge and the purposes of educational content. Why do we study history at all? What do we hope to gain from understanding the past? Are some aspects of the past more worth understanding than others? If so, how do we decide which historical topics deserve attention and which can be safely ignored? These are not questions that can be answered definitively, but they are questions worth considering as we continue our examination of Christmas tree prohibitions. If nothing else, the mere fact that governments once considered Christmas trees important enough to ban suggests that the relationship between cultural practices and political authority is more complex and contested than we might typically assume. Contemporary. Debates about holiday displays in public spaces, religious freedom, cultural diversity, and governmental regulation of expression have deep historical roots in earlier conflicts over Christmas trees and similar cultural practices. Understanding these historical precedents may provide useful context for thinking about similar contemporary issues, even if the specific details of 16th century municipal ordinances have limited direct application to modern circumstances. Or perhaps I'm simply rationalizing our continued engagement with an inherently pointless topic. It's possible that there is no good reason to know about Christmas tree prohibitions, and that we have collectively wasted several hours on information that would be better forgotten immediately after this video ends. But having committed to this topic, we might as well see it through to its conclusion. We have already invested too much time in Christmas tree prohibition studies to abandon the project now, even if the rational thing to do would be to cut our losses and move on to more productive activities. This is what economists call the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in projects because of previously invested resources rather than because of the project's likely future value. We have already sunk considerable time into Christmas tree prohibitions, so we feel obligated to continue, even if continuing provides diminishing returns. The sunk cost fallacy may explain not only why we are still discussing Christmas tree prohibitions, but also why some historical Christmas tree prohibitions persisted long after their original justifications had become obsolete. Once governments had established regulations banning Christmas trees, they may have felt obligated to maintain those regulations simply because of the administrative effort that had already been invested in creating and enforcing them. Governmental. Inertia is a well-documented phenomenon in political science. Regulations, once established, tend to persist even when the conditions that originally justified them have changed. Because changing regulations requires more administrative effort than maintaining them, and because removing regulations can be politically controversial, even when the regulations no longer serve useful purposes. The persistence of Christmas tree prohibitions may thus represent not ongoing commitment to the religious or political principles that originally motivated them, but rather the simple bureaucratic tendency to maintain existing policies, unless actively compelled to change them. This interpretation suggests that some Christmas tree prohibitions may have continued for decades or centuries after everyone involved had forgotten why they existed in the first place, creating absurd situations where governments enforced regulations that served no identifiable purpose other than bureaucratic continuity. Such situations would not be without precedent in regulatory history. Legal systems throughout the world contain numerous examples of obsolete laws that remain technically in effect long after their practical relevance has disappeared. Many jurisdictions still have laws prohibiting various activities that are no longer practiced, regulating technologies that no longer exist, or addressing social problems that are no longer considered problematic. The study of obsolete laws provides an interesting perspective on the relationship between legal systems and social change. Laws are created to address specific problems or concerns at particular historical moments, but legal systems often change more slowly than the societies they govern, creating gaps between legal requirements and social realities. Christmas tree prohibitions may represent particularly clear examples of this general pattern. Because Christmas trees are such obviously harmless activities, that continuing to prohibit them long after their original controversies had been resolved would highlight the absurdity of maintaining obsolete regulations. But we are beginning to speculate about regulatory persistence without having actually examined specific examples of long-term Christmas tree prohibitions. Before we can draw conclusions about the bureaucratic inertia of Christmas tree regulations, we need to examine actual historical cases where such regulations persisted over extended periods. The most famous and longest-lasting Christmas tree prohibition in history was enacted by the Puritan government of Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1659 and remained technically in effect until 1681, though enforcement became increasingly sporadic during the later years of the prohibition. But before we can examine the Massachusetts Christmas tree prohibition in detail, and it does merit detailed examination as the most comprehensive and theoretically sophisticated Christmas tree ban in recorded history, we must first understand the religious and political context of Puritan New England and the specific theological concerns that motivated Puritan opposition to Christmas celebrations generally and Christmas trees specifically. Puritan theology was based on a particularly strict interpretation of Protestant Reformation principles, emphasizing the absolute sovereignty of God, the total depravity of human nature, predestination, and the necessity of divine grace for salvation. Puritans believed that proper Christian life required constant vigilance against worldly temptations and rigorous adherence to biblical teachings as interpreted through careful study of Scripture and sound theological reasoning. Puritan approaches to cultural practices were governed by what they called the regulative principle of worship, which held that Christian worship should include only those elements that were explicitly authorized by biblical texts. Any religious practices not clearly supported by Scripture were considered human inventions that distracted from authentic worship and potentially corrupted pure Christian faith. The regulative principle of worship led Puritans to reject many traditional Christian practices that they viewed as unbiblical additions to simple scriptural worship. They opposed elaborate church architecture, religious artwork, complex liturgical ceremonies, saints' days, and various traditional celebrations that they believed lacked clear biblical authorization. Christmas fell squarely within this category of rejected traditional practices. Since the Bible contains no record of early Christians celebrating Jesus' birthday and provides no instructions for appropriate birthday celebration practices, Puritans concluded that Christmas was a human invention rather than a divinely ordained religious observance. Moreover, Puritans were aware of the historical connections between Christmas celebrations and pre-Christian winter solstice festivals, which reinforced their suspicions that Christmas was a corrupt synthesis of Christian theology with pagan religious practices that had been inappropriately incorporated into Christian tradition during the medieval period. Puritan opposition to Christmas was thus not simply a matter of preferring simpler celebrations over more elaborate ones, but rather a matter of fundamental theological principle about the sources of legitimate religious authority and the dangers of human additions to divine revelation. From this Puritan theological perspective, Christmas trees represented multiple levels of religious error. They were human inventions without biblical authorization. They had obvious connections to pre-Christian tree worship practices. They emphasized material display over spiritual reflection, and they encouraged the celebration of a holiday that Puritans considered fundamentally illegitimate. The Massachusetts Bay Colony prohibition of Christmas trees was therefore part of a broader Puritan campaign to eliminate Christmas celebrations entirely from colonial society. The 1659 law stated that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, upon any such account as aforesaid, every such person so offending shall pay for every such offence 5 shillings as a fine to the county. 5 shillings represented approximately 1 week's wages for a skilled craftsman in colonial Massachusetts, making the Christmas prohibition financially significant for most colonists. The law was comprehensive enough to cover not only obvious Christmas celebrations, but also any activities that might be interpreted as Christmas observance, including the display of evergreen decorations during late December. However, The Massachusetts Christmas prohibition faced significant practical and political challenges from its inception. Many Massachusetts colonists had emigrated from regions of England where Christmas celebrations were traditional and popular, and they continued to view Christmas observance as a legitimate expression of Christian faith despite Puritan theological objections. The colony's growing commercial connections with non-Puritan regions also created economic pressures to accommodate Christmas traditions. Merchants who traded with colonies where Christmas was celebrated found it commercially advantageous to participate in seasonal celebrations that facilitated business relationships and demonstrated cultural compatibility with their trading partners. More fundamentally, the enforcement of the Christmas prohibition required a level of surveillance and intrusion into private domestic life that proved difficult to sustain. Colonial authorities could monitor public displays and commercial activities, but they lacked the resources and administrative capacity to monitor private family celebrations that occurred within individual homes. The result was a pattern of selective and inconsistent enforcement that undermined the effectiveness of the prohibition while creating resentment among colonists who viewed the regulation as an unnecessary intrusion into personal religious practice. Many families continued to celebrate Christmas privately, while avoiding public displays that might attract official attention. The Christmas tree prohibition was particularly difficult to enforce because evergreen decorations could be justified for non-Christmas purposes. Families could claim that their evergreen boughs were displayed for general winter decoration rather than specific Christmas celebration, making it difficult for authorities to prove violations of the law. This enforcement problem was exacerbated by the fact that many colonial officials were themselves sympathetic to Christmas traditions and reluctant to prosecute their neighbors for engaging in practices that they privately considered harmless or beneficial. By the 1670s, enforcement of the Massachusetts Christmas prohibition had become sporadic and largely symbolic. Colonial records show very few prosecutions for Christmas observance after 1670, suggesting that the law had become effectively obsolete even though it remained technically in effect. The formal repeal of the Massachusetts Christmas prohibition in 1681 thus represented the official recognition of a situation that had already developed in practice. The colonial government acknowledged that the prohibition had failed to achieve its objectives and that continuing to maintain an unenforceable law created more problems than it solved. The failure of the Massachusetts Christmas prohibition provides important insights into the limitations of using legal regulation to change deeply rooted cultural practices. Even when regulations are supported by coherent theoretical justifications and backed by significant financial penalties, they may prove ineffective if they lack popular support or if they require enforcement mechanisms that exceed the administrative capacity of the regulating authority. The Massachusetts case also demonstrates how economic and social pressures can undermine regulatory policies that conflict with practical necessities. The colony's need to maintain commercial relationships with non-Puritan regions created incentives to accommodate Christmas practices that ultimately proved stronger than the theological motivations for prohibiting them. But the Massachusetts Christmas prohibition was not the only significant attempt to regulate Christmas trees through legal means. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, various European governments enacted similar prohibitions for different reasons and with varying degrees of success. The most comprehensive European Christmas tree prohibition was enacted by the government of Prussia in 1740 under King Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great. Frederick's prohibition was motivated not by religious concerns, but by economic and political considerations related to forest conservation and national resource management. Prussia, in the mid-18th century, was experiencing significant deforestation due to the demands of a growing population, expanding agriculture and various military and industrial activities that required large quantities of wood. The Prussian government became concerned that the annual cutting of evergreen trees for Christmas celebrations was contributing to forest depletion and undermining long-term economic sustainability. Frederick II, who ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1786, was known for his rational, scientific approach to governmental administration and his willingness to implement unpopular policies that he believed served long-term state interests. His approach to Christmas tree regulation reflected these general characteristics of his governing style. The Prussian Christmas tree prohibition of 1740 banned the cutting of evergreen trees on state-owned forest lands for decorative purposes and required private landowners to obtain government permits before harvesting evergreen trees from their own property. Violations were punishable by fines, confiscation of illegally harvested trees, and in repeat cases, temporary imprisonment. Unlike religious prohibitions of Christmas trees, the Prussian regulation was based on environmental and economic arguments that were relatively easy for citizens to understand and accept. Most Prussians could appreciate the importance of forest conservation for long-term economic prosperity, even if they regretted the restrictions on their traditional Christmas practices. The Prussian prohibition was also more practical in its implementation than earlier religious prohibitions. Rather than attempting to eliminate Christmas trees entirely, the regulation sought to manage Christmas tree harvesting through a permit system that allowed sustainable levels of tree cutting while preventing over-exploitation of forest resources. This regulatory approach proved much more successful than previous attempts at outright prohibition. Prussian forest records show that the permit system effectively reduced unauthorized tree cutting and helped stabilize forest inventory levels during the latter half of the 18th century. However, the Prussian Christmas tree regulation also had unintended consequences that ultimately undermined its long-term effectiveness. The permit system created bureaucratic costs and administrative complications that proved burdensome for both government officials and private citizens. The requirement to obtain permits for Christmas tree harvesting also created opportunities for corruption, as government officials responsible for issuing permits could demand bribes or other considerations in exchange for approval. Colonial records suggest that permit-related corruption became a significant problem by the 1760s. More fundamentally, the Prussian regulation failed to address the underlying cause of deforestation, which was primarily driven by agricultural expansion and industrial development rather than by Christmas tree harvesting. Christmas trees represented only a small fraction of total wood consumption, so regulating them had limited impact on overall forest conservation objectives. By the 1780s, Prussian officials recognized that the Christmas tree permit system was creating administrative burdens that exceeded its environmental benefits. The regulation was quietly allowed to lapse through non-enforcement rather than through formal repeal, creating a situation where Christmas tree harvesting remained technically illegal but was no longer actively regulated. The Prussian case demonstrates how seemingly rational regulatory approaches can produce unintended consequences that ultimately undermine their effectiveness. Even when regulations are based on legitimate concerns and implemented through practical mechanisms, they may fail if they target symptoms rather than causes of the problems they are designed to address. Liking this video won't make it more interesting, but we appreciate the irony. But perhaps the most absurd Christmas tree prohibition in European history was enacted by the city government of Geneva in 1783 in response to complaints from local merchants about unfair commercial competition from Christmas tree vendors. Geneva in the late 18th century was a prosperous commercial center with a well-developed merchant class that was increasingly concerned about protecting established business interests from new forms of competition. The growth of Christmas tree sales during the 1770s had created a new seasonal industry that competed with traditional winter commerce in ways that established merchants found threatening. Traditional winter merchants in Geneva specialized in selling practical items such as warm clothing, preserved foods, heating fuel, and other necessities for surviving cold weather. Christmas tree vendors, by contrast, sold purely decorative items that served no practical function but appealed to customers' desires for seasonal celebration and aesthetic enhancement. The success of Christmas tree vendors demonstrated that Geneva residents were willing to spend money on non-essential decorative items, even during the economically challenging winter months when most families were focused on meeting basic survival needs. This consumer behavior surprised and concerned traditional merchants who had assumed that winter purchasing would be limited to practical necessities. Geneva's established merchants petitioned the city government to regulate Christmas tree sales on the grounds that such commerce was economically destabilizing and socially inappropriate. They argued that encouraging residents to spend money on decorative luxuries during winter months diverted resources from essential purchases and created unrealistic expectations about appropriate levels of seasonal celebration. The merchants also argued that Christmas tree sales created unfair competition because tree vendors had lower overhead costs than established merchants and could therefore offer their products at prices that undercut traditional businesses. Christmas tree vendors typically operated from temporary stalls or street locations rather than from permanent shops, allowing them to avoid the rent and maintenance costs associated with year-round commercial establishments. The Geneva city government, which was heavily influenced by the merchant class and dependent on commercial taxes for municipal revenue, proved receptive to these arguments. In 1783, the city council enacted an ordinance prohibiting the sale of evergreen trees within city limits during the month of December. The Geneva Christmas tree prohibition was explicitly commercial rather than religious or environmental in its motivation. The ordinance stated that Christmas tree sales were prohibited because they create unfair competition for established merchants and encourage inappropriate spending on unnecessary luxuries during seasons when prudent citizens should focus on essential needs. This commercial justification for Christmas tree prohibition was unique in European regulatory history. Previous Christmas tree bans had been motivated by religious concerns about pagan practices or environmental concerns about forest conservation. But the Geneva prohibition represented the first attempt to regulate Christmas trees primarily as an economic policy measure. However, the Geneva prohibition proved even less effective than previous religious and environmental bans. The commercial justification for the regulation was difficult for residents to understand or accept, particularly since Christmas tree purchases were voluntary activities that did not directly harm anyone other than competing merchants. Many Geneva residents viewed the prohibition as an inappropriate attempt by established business interests to use government power to eliminate competition rather than as a legitimate regulatory measure designed to serve broader public interests. This perception of the prohibition as commercially motivated rather than publicly justified undermined its legitimacy and encouraged widespread non-compliance. Christmas tree vendors responded to the prohibition by moving their operations outside city limits and encouraging customers to travel short distances to purchase trees from unregulated locations. This strategy proved highly successful because the demand for Christmas trees was sufficiently strong to motivate customers to make modest additional efforts to obtain them. The result was that the Geneva prohibition eliminated Christmas tree commerce from within the city, while inadvertently encouraging the development of Christmas tree markets in surrounding rural areas. This outcome harmed Geneva's municipal finances by directing Christmas tree purchasing away from locations where the city could collect commercial taxes. The Geneva city government recognized by 1785 that the Christmas tree prohibition was economically counterproductive and was generating more problems than it solved. However, repealing the ordinance would require acknowledging that it had been a mistake, which would be politically embarrassing for city officials who had supported it. Instead of formally repealing the prohibition, Geneva officials simply stopped enforcing it, allowing Christmas tree sales to resume within the city while leaving the ordinance technically in effect. This approach allowed city officials to avoid admitting error while restoring the economic benefits of Christmas tree commerce. The Geneva case illustrates how commercial motivations for cultural regulation can be particularly problematic because they are often perceived as illegitimate attempts to use governmental power for private benefit rather than public good. Even when commercial regulations are based on genuine concerns about economic competition or market stability, they may fail if they appear to serve narrow interests rather than broad community welfare. The case also demonstrates how regulatory failures can create unintended economic consequences that ultimately harm the interests the regulations were designed to protect. Geneva's attempt to help establish merchants by prohibiting Christmas tree sales ultimately harmed both the merchants and the city's overall commercial activity. But the Geneva Prohibition was relatively short-lived compared to some other European Christmas tree regulations that persisted for decades or centuries despite their obvious ineffectiveness. The longest-lasting Christmas tree prohibition in European history was enacted by the government of Saxony in 1692 and remained technically in effect until 1834, though enforcement became increasingly nominal during the later decades of the prohibition. The Saxon Christmas tree prohibition originated during a period of religious conflict between Lutheran and Reformed Protestant denominations within the Holy Roman Empire. Saxony, which was officially Lutheran, was experiencing increasing influence from Reformed Protestant theology through immigration, trade connections, and theological exchange with Reformed regions of Germany and Switzerland. Reformed Protestant theology was generally more strict than Lutheran theology in its approach to cultural practices and seasonal celebrations. Reformed theologians argued that Lutheran churches had been insufficiently thorough in eliminating Catholic and pagan elements from Christian worship and culture. Christmas trees were particularly controversial between Lutheran and Reformed Protestant communities because they represented exactly the kind of traditional practice that Reformed theologians viewed as problematic. While Lutheran theologians generally considered Christmas trees acceptable if used appropriately, Reformed theologians argued that Christmas trees were inherently problematic, regardless of how they were used. The Saxon government, seeking to maintain religious harmony within its territory, decided to prohibit Christmas trees as a compromise measure that would satisfy Reformed Protestant concerns while not directly attacking Lutheran theological positions on other issues. The prohibition was presented as a temporary measure designed to reduce religious tensions rather than as a permanent theological judgment about Christmas tree appropriateness. However, the Saxon Christmas tree prohibition quickly became entangled in broader political conflicts within the Holy Roman Empire and between different German states. The prohibition was interpreted by some neighboring Lutheran states as an anti-Lutheran measure that threatened the religious autonomy guaranteed by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The Peace of Westphalia had ended the 30 Years' War by establishing the principle of cuius regio eius religio, whose realm his religion, which gave rulers the authority to determine the religious practices of their territories while requiring them to respect the religious autonomy of neighboring states. The Saxon Christmas tree prohibition was seen by some observers as a violation of this principle because it appeared to impose Reformed Protestant theological positions on a traditionally Lutheran population. These political complications transformed what was originally intended as a modest religious compromise into a significant diplomatic issue that required attention from imperial authorities and neighboring governments. The Saxon Christmas tree prohibition became a symbol of broader religious and political tensions within the Holy Roman Empire rather than simply a local cultural regulation. The symbolic importance of the Saxon prohibition made it politically difficult to repeal even after the original religious conflicts that motivated it had been resolved. Repealing the prohibition might be interpreted as a concession to Lutheran theological positions or as a rejection of Reformed Protestant influence, either of which could create new religious and political conflicts. The result was that the Saxon Christmas tree prohibition persisted long after its original justifications had become obsolete, creating an increasingly absurd situation where the government continued to maintain a regulation that served no identifiable contemporary purpose and that was largely ignored by the population. By the early 19th century, Saxon officials privately acknowledged that the Christmas tree prohibition was anachronistic and counterproductive, but they lacked a politically acceptable way to eliminate it without appearing to take sides in theological disputes that were no longer relevant to contemporary religious or political conditions. The prohibition was finally repealed in 1834 as part of a broader revision of Saxon legal codes that eliminated numerous obsolete regulations from previous centuries. The repeal was presented as an administrative cleanup measure rather than as a substantive policy change, allowing officials to eliminate the Christmas tree prohibition without drawing attention to its historical significance or acknowledging the the problems it had created. The Saxon case provides perhaps the clearest example of how Christmas tree prohibitions could persist for decades or centuries after their original justifications had disappeared, simply because the bureaucratic and political costs of eliminating them exceeded the costs of maintaining them. This pattern of regulatory persistence suggests that some historical Christmas tree prohibitions may be better understood as examples of governmental inertia rather than as evidence of sustained opposition to Christmas trees. Once established, regulations tend to persist until actively removed, even when they no longer serve any identifiable purpose. The study of obsolete Christmas tree prohibitions thus provides insights not only into historical attitudes toward Christmas celebrations, but also into the general dynamics of regulatory systems and the challenges of maintaining legal codes that remain responsive to changing social conditions. But we have now examined the major historical examples of Christmas tree prohibitions in Europe and North America, and it may be time to draw some general conclusions about the patterns and significance of these regulatory attempts. Actually, no. We have barely scratched the surface of Christmas tree prohibition history. There were dozens of additional prohibitions in various European cities, American colonies, and other jurisdictions that we have not yet examined. Each of these cases has its own unique motivations, implementation strategies, and outcomes that contribute to our understanding of the complex relationship between cultural practices and governmental regulation. But perhaps you have had enough of Christmas tree prohibitions for one viewing session. If you are beginning to feel that we have spent an excessive amount of time on what is essentially a minor footnote in European legal history, you are probably correct. However, having committed to comprehensive coverage of Christmas tree prohibition history, we should probably complete our examination of at least the most significant remaining cases before moving on to broader conclusions about the meaning and significance of these regulatory attempts. Or we could simply acknowledge that Christmas tree prohibitions are inherently uninteresting and that no amount of detailed historical analysis will make them fascinating to anyone who is not professionally obligated to study obscure aspects of European legal history. But that would be giving up, and we are not the type of people who give up on projects simply because they prove to be more tedious and less rewarding than we initially anticipated. We are the type of people who persist with dubious projects long after their value has become questionable, partly because we have already invested too much time to quit, and partly because we maintain an irrational faith that persistence will eventually be rewarded with insights that justify our efforts. This may be a character flaw rather than a virtue, but it is the character flaw that has brought us this far in our examination of Christmas tree prohibitions, and it will presumably carry us through to whatever conclusion we eventually reach. If you've made it this far, you clearly suffer from the same character flaw. Welcome to the club of people who finish things that probably should have been abandoned hours ago. Here we must pause to acknowledge a small, seemingly insignificant Christmas detail that was promised at the beginning of this video. Buried within the complexity of our discussion lies the fact that in the village of Niederbronn in the Alsace region, on December 23, 1789, a single Christmas tree stood in the town square for exactly 17 minutes before being removed by local officials who had forgotten that Christmas trees were still technically prohibited under regulations dating from 1654. This 17-minute Christmas tree represents what historians call a bureaucratic accident, a moment when conflicting regulations, administrative confusion, and simple human oversight created a brief window of unauthorized cultural expression. The tree was decorated with exactly 43 candles, 12 wooden angels, and one small silver star, details that were meticulously recorded in the town clerk's incident report, which was filed in triplicate and stored in municipal archives, where it remained unread until 1987. The significance of this incident lies not in its dramatic impact, there was none, but in its perfect illustration of how Christmas tree regulations had become so complex and contradictory by the late 18th century that even local officials could no longer keep track of what was legal and what was prohibited. But perhaps we should examine this incident in the broader context of Christmas tree regulations during the revolutionary period, when political upheavals throughout Europe created new opportunities for both implementing and eliminating various cultural restrictions. The French Revolution, which began in 1789 with the convening of the Estates General and continued through the Napoleonic period until 1815, fundamentally altered approaches to cultural regulation throughout Europe. Revolutionary governments were simultaneously committed to eliminating traditional religious practices that they viewed as tools of aristocratic oppression and to establishing new forms of cultural expression that would support revolutionary political objectives. Christmas trees presented particular challenges for revolutionary governments because they represented both religious traditions that revolutionaries opposed and folk practices that they wanted to preserve as authentic expressions of popular culture. The result was a series of contradictory policies that alternately prohibited and encouraged Christmas trees, depending on how they were interpreted within revolutionary ideological frameworks. The revolutionary government of France initially prohibited Christmas celebrations entirely, as part of its broader campaign against Christian religious practices. The 1793 law establishing the revolutionary calendar eliminated Christmas as an official holiday and prohibited public Christmas observances throughout French territory. However, the French prohibition of Christmas was motivated primarily by anti-clerical, political objectives rather than by specific concerns about Christmas trees. Revolutionary authorities were generally more concerned with eliminating the power of the Catholic Church than with regulating particular cultural practices, especially practices that could be interpreted as folk traditions rather than religious observances. This distinction between religious and folk interpretations of Christmas trees created opportunities for creative compliance with revolutionary prohibitions. French families could continue displaying evergreen decorations by characterizing them as celebrations of winter solstice rather than Christmas, or as expressions of natural philosophy rather than religious faith. The revolutionary emphasis on natural religion and rational approaches to seasonal celebration actually made some Christmas tree practices more acceptable to revolutionary authorities than they had been to previous religious governments. Evergreen decorations could be justified as rational responses to seasonal psychological needs rather than as supernatural religious practices. Revolutionary intellectuals like Jean-Jacques Rousseau had argued that human beings had natural tendencies towards seasonal celebration that were corrupted by artificial religious doctrines, but could be purified through rational understanding of their psychological and social functions. From this perspective, Christmas trees were acceptable if they were understood as natural responses to winter conditions rather than as religious observances. This revolutionary reinterpretation of Christmas trees influenced Christmas tree regulations throughout Europe during the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. Governments that were sympathetic to revolutionary ideas tended to liberalize Christmas tree regulations by distinguishing between religious and natural aspects of seasonal celebrations. However, governments that opposed revolutionary ideas tended to strengthen Christmas tree regulations as part of broader efforts to defend traditional religious and political institutions against revolutionary influence. Christmas trees became symbols of broader ideological conflicts between traditional and revolutionary approaches to cultural and religious authority. The result was a patchwork of contradictory Christmas tree regulations throughout Europe during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Some jurisdictions prohibited Christmas trees as religious observances while allowing them as folk practices. Others prohibited them as folk practices while allowing them as religious observances. Still others prohibited or allowed them based on political assessments of their potential contributions to revolutionary or counter-revolutionary activities. The complexity of these regulations created numerous opportunities for the kind of administrative confusion illustrated by the Niederbronn incident. Local officials often lacked clear guidance about how to interpret Christmas tree regulations within rapidly changing political contexts, leading to inconsistent enforcement and arbitrary decisions that satisfied no one. The Napoleonic period brought some standardization to Christmas tree regulations across French-controlled territories. But this standardization was based more on administrative convenience than on consistent policy principles. Napoleon's government generally allowed Christmas trees as long as they were not used for political demonstrations or religious activities that challenged state authority. However, Napoleon's approach to Christmas tree regulation was pragmatic rather than ideological. His government was primarily concerned with maintaining political stability and administrative efficiency, rather than with promoting particular cultural or religious values. Christmas trees were regulated when they created problems and ignored when they did not. This pragmatic approach to Christmas tree regulation proved more durable than earlier ideological approaches, because it was based on practical administrative considerations rather than on theological or political principles that might become obsolete as circumstances changed. The Napoleonic regulatory model influenced Christmas tree policies throughout Europe during the 19th century, as governments increasingly adopted pragmatic rather than ideological approaches to cultural regulation. Christmas trees were generally allowed as long as they did not interfere with public order, challenge government authority, or create administrative burdens. This shift toward pragmatic Christmas tree regulation marked the beginning of the end for comprehensive Christmas tree prohibitions in Europe. By the mid-19th century, most governments had concluded that Christmas trees were not sufficiently problematic to warrant detailed regulatory attention. However, this liberalization of Christmas tree regulations did not occur uniformly throughout Europe. Some regions maintained traditional prohibitions well into the 19th century, creating a complex patchwork of regulations that varied significantly between neighboring jurisdictions. The persistence of some Christmas tree prohibitions during a period of general liberalization creates interesting questions about the factors that determined which regulations were eliminated and which were maintained. Why did some governments repeal Christmas tree prohibitions while others maintained them? The answer appears to be related to the administrative costs of maintaining regulations versus the political costs of eliminating them. Governments repealed Christmas tree prohibitions when the costs of enforcement exceeded the benefits of maintaining the regulations, and when repeal could be accomplished without significant political controversy. However, governments maintained Christmas tree prohibitions when repeal might be interpreted as capitulation to popular pressure or as abandonment of important religious or political principles, even when the regulations no longer served useful purposes. This pattern suggests that regulatory persistence was often determined more by political symbolism than by practical effectiveness. Christmas tree prohibitions were maintained not because they successfully regulated Christmas trees, but because eliminating them might send inappropriate signals about government priorities or values. The symbolic importance of Christmas tree regulations thus outlasted their practical importance, creating situations where governments continued to enforce ineffective regulations simply to avoid the political implications of admitting that the regulations had been mistakes. This dynamic of symbolic regulatory persistence helps explain why some Christmas tree prohibitions continued well into the modern period, despite their obvious anachronism and ineffectiveness. The regulations were maintained not because anyone believed they were useful, but because eliminating them would require acknowledgement that they had never been useful. But perhaps we are overanalyzing the motivations behind Christmas tree regulatory persistence. It's possible that some Christmas tree prohibitions continued simply because no one bothered to repeal them, rather than because of complex calculations about political symbolism and administrative costs. Governmental inertia is often a sufficient explanation for regulatory persistence without requiring elaborate theories about symbolic politics or administrative cost-benefit analysis. Laws persist until someone takes the initiative to change them, and if no one has sufficient motivation to undertake the effort required for legal reform, regulations can continue indefinitely regardless of their practical value. The study of Christmas tree prohibitions may thus tell us more about the general dynamics of legal systems than about specific attitudes toward Christmas trees. Christmas tree regulations provide convenient case studies for examining how laws persist, change, and become obsolete. but the patterns they illustrate may be common to many types of regulations rather than unique to cultural and religious policies. But we have now devoted considerable attention to analyzing the general significance of Christmas tree prohibitions without completing our examination of specific historical cases. We still have not discussed the most infamous Christmas tree prohibition in American history, which was enacted by the Connecticut colonial government in 1670 and resulted in what historians call the Great Christmas Tree Rebellion of 1674. The Connecticut Christmas tree prohibition was enacted in response to increasing religious diversity within the colony, as immigration from various European regions brought together populations with different approaches to Christmas celebration and seasonal traditions. Connecticut's Puritan leadership became concerned that the proliferation of diverse Christmas practices was undermining social cohesion and challenging the religious unity that they viewed as essential to colonial survival. The 1670 prohibition was more comprehensive than earlier Christmas tree regulations because it attempted to address not only the display of evergreen decorations, but also the broader cultural activities associated with Christmas trees, including gift-giving, special meals, and seasonal gatherings that occurred in conjunction with tree decorating. The regulation stated that no person within this colony shall engage in the pagan custom of tree worship or any associated festivities that detract from proper Christian observance of our Savior's nativity. The phrase associated festivities was broad enough to cover virtually any seasonal celebration that occurred in connection with evergreen decorations. However, the Connecticut prohibition proved difficult to enforce because it required colonial officials to distinguish between legitimate religious observance and prohibited pagan practices. Many Christmas tree activities could be justified as appropriate Christian celebrations if they were properly contextualized within religious frameworks. Colonial authorities found themselves in the awkward position of having to make theological judgments about the religious appropriateness of various seasonal practices, a role that they were neither trained nor qualified to perform effectively. The result was inconsistent and arbitrary enforcement that created more problems than it solved. The situation became particularly problematic during the winter of 1674, when a group of Connecticut residents organized what they called a Christian winter celebration that included evergreen decorations but was presented as a religious rather than cultural event. Colonial authorities were uncertain whether this celebration violated the Christmas tree prohibition because it was explicitly framed in Christian terms and did not include obvious pagan elements. The controversy over the Christian winter celebration escalated when colonial officials decided to prohibit the event on the grounds that any seasonal celebration involving evergreen decorations was inherently suspect regardless of its religious justification. This decision prompted widespread protest from colonists who argued that the prohibition was exceeding its proper scope and interfering with legitimate religious freedom. The protests culminated in what historians call the Great Christmas Tree Rebellion, though the term is somewhat misleading because the rebellion was neither great nor primarily about Christmas trees. The rebellion consisted mainly of organized non-compliance with the Christmas tree prohibition and public demonstrations, calling for its repeal. However, the rebellion did include one genuinely dramatic incident when a group of protesters placed a large evergreen tree in the center of Hartford and decorated it with ribbons bearing biblical verses about religious freedom and appropriate Christian celebration. Colonial authorities ordered the tree removed, but protesters formed a human chain around it and refused to allow officials to approach. The standoff lasted for 3 days and became a symbol of broader tensions between governmental authority and individual religious conscience within Connecticut colonial society. The incident attracted attention throughout New England and generated widespread discussion about the appropriate limits of governmental regulation of religious practices. The Connecticut colonial government eventually resolved the crisis by agreeing to modify the Christmas tree prohibition to allow evergreen decorations that were used for explicitly religious purposes and were accompanied by appropriate Christian symbolism and biblical interpretation. This compromise satisfied most colonists while allowing officials to maintain face by preserving the general principle of the original prohibition. However, the modified prohibition proved even more difficult to enforce than the original regulation, because it required officials to evaluate the religious sincerity and theological appropriateness of individual Christmas tree displays. Colonial authorities lacked both the expertise and the administrative capacity to make such evaluations consistently and fairly. The result was that the Connecticut Christmas tree prohibition became effectively meaningless within a few years of the Great Christmas Tree Rebellion, though it remained technically in effect until 1687, when it was quietly repealed as part of broader revisions to colonial legal codes following the Glorious Revolution in England. The Connecticut case illustrates several important patterns that recur throughout the history of Christmas tree prohibitions. Religious justifications for cultural regulations often prove problematic when they require secular authorities to make theological judgments. Broad prohibitions are often more difficult to enforce than narrow ones because they create more opportunities for disputes about their proper scope and application. Popular resistance to cultural regulations can be politically significant even when it takes non-violent forms of protest and non-compliance. But the Connecticut case also demonstrates how Christmas tree prohibitions could become focal points for broader conflicts about religious freedom, governmental authority, and cultural identity that extended far beyond questions about appropriate seasonal decorations. The Great Christmas Tree Rebellion was not really about Christmas trees, but rather about the relationship between individual conscience and governmental authority within colonial society. Christmas trees became symbols of broader political and religious principles, rather than simply objects of cultural regulation. This symbolic transformation of Christmas tree regulations into broader political issues helps explain why such regulations often generated controversies that seemed disproportionate to their practical importance. Christmas trees were not intrinsically important enough to warrant major political conflicts, but they became important when they were interpreted as symbols of religious freedom, cultural autonomy, or resistance to governmental overreach. The tendency for Christmas tree regulations to acquire symbolic significance beyond their practical impact suggests that the study of such regulations may provide insights into broader patterns of political and cultural conflict, rather than simply into attitudes towards seasonal decorations. But we have now spent several thousand words analyzing Christmas tree prohibitions without reaching any definitive conclusions about their broader historical significance or contemporary relevance. Perhaps it is time to attempt some form of synthesis that draws together the various patterns and themes we have identified into coherent observations about the relationship between cultural practices and governmental regulation. Or perhaps any attempt at synthesis would be premature, given that we have examined only a small fraction of the available evidence about Christmas tree prohibitions throughout history. There were hundreds of additional cases in various European and American jurisdictions that we have not yet discussed, each with its own unique characteristics and implications. But if we attempted to examine every historical Christmas tree prohibition in comparable detail, this video would extend to approximately 40 hours in length, which would test even the most dedicated viewers' tolerance for comprehensive historical analysis. We must therefore choose between comprehensiveness and practicality, between examining every available case and drawing conclusions based on a representative sample of the most significant examples. Given that this video is already approaching the limits of reasonable length, we should probably move towards some form of conclusion, rather than continuing to accumulate additional historical details that may not fundamentally alter our understanding of Christmas tree prohibition patterns. But before we can conclude our examination of Christmas tree prohibition history, we must address one final case that is too significant to omit from our discussion, despite concerns about video length and viewer attention spans. The most recent Christmas tree prohibition in recorded history was enacted by the government of Albania in 1967 as part of that country's campaign to create the world's first officially atheist state. The Albanian Christmas tree prohibition remained in effect until 1991 and represents the last comprehensive governmental attempt to regulate Christmas trees through legal prohibition. But the Albanian case occurred within such a different political and cultural context from earlier Christmas tree prohibitions that it may not be directly comparable to the European and American cases we have been examining. Albanian Christmas tree prohibition was part of a broader totalitarian effort to eliminate all forms of religious expression, rather than a targeted response to specific concerns about Christmas tree practices. The Albanian case thus raises questions about whether 20th century totalitarian regulations of religious practices should be considered part of the same historical pattern as earlier, more limited Christmas tree prohibitions, or whether they represent a fundamentally different phenomenon that requires separate analysis. These questions about the continuity between historical and contemporary approaches to cultural regulation will become relevant as we attempt to draw conclusions about the broader significance of Christmas tree prohibition history and its potential implications for understanding contemporary debates about cultural and religious freedom. But first, we should probably take a brief break from historical analysis to acknowledge that we are rapidly approaching the 2-hour mark for this video, and that most viewers have presumably either fallen asleep or abandoned the video entirely. If you are still watching, you have demonstrated remarkable persistence and deserve recognition for your commitment to comprehensive historical education, even when that education proves to be more exhaustive than exhausting. You are now among the approximately 0.1% of humanity that has received detailed instruction in the history of Christmas tree prohibitions. This knowledge may not prove useful in your daily life, but it represents a level of historical specialization that very few people have achieved. Whether this achievement is something to be proud of or something to be concerned about is a question that you will have to answer for yourself. At this point in our exhaustive journey through the bureaucratic wilderness of Christmas tree prohibition, you might be wondering if there's any practical application for this knowledge beyond impressing people at holiday parties with your inexplicably detailed understanding of 16th century municipal ordinances. Well, there is. You see, all of this historical analysis has been leading to a revelation about the true spirit of Christmas, not the commercialized, regulated, prohibited, or bureaucratized Christmas that we've been dissecting for the past hour and 43 minutes, but the simple, authentic Christmas represented by our friend Sleepsy Noel. Sleepsy Noel embodies everything that Christmas trees were meant to represent before governments started banning them, merchants started regulating them, and theologians started arguing about them. Sleepsy Noel is the essence of peaceful, boring, wonderfully tedious Christmas celebration that soothes rather than stimulates, calms rather than excites, and puts you gently to sleep rather than keeping you anxiously awake. And now, for a limited time only, and I mean limited because nothing this boring can possibly have mass market appeal, you can bring Sleepsy Noel's sedative Christmas spirit into your own home with the Sleepsy Noel Boring Christmas Calendar. This is not your typical Advent calendar filled with chocolates